Wow, this is really cool. I also just have to say it's really neat coming from Canada. I'm from like a small island on the west coast of Canada, so to be standing at Google London is kind of wild right now. Just like talking about my little book. My name is Cait Flanders. Thank you to Nicola for inviting me here. I have been a personal finance blogger for the past, like 7 or 8 years at this point. My last job that I had was I was managing editor of a financial startup for about 3 years. And I've done a lot of freelance writing in the personal finance space, so for other financial startups, different banks, and stuff like that. And now I am an author, which is pretty wild, like I said, because I'm just from a little island on the west coast of Canada. And now I'm like, you guys are holding a book that became a Wall Street Journal bestseller, and every day I'm just sort of like, what? But it's really amazing to be here today. So I will take you a little bit step backwards. Having a career in personal finance is something that I never ever set out to do. I can honestly say, looking back on my life and the different interests that I've had, I never thought that that is something I would do, that I would be writing about how people could be better with money. And I say that because I have not always been good at money. So I grew up, very fortunately, with a family that talked about money all the time. I actually always say, and it's a line in the book, but it's true. So my dad's a sailor, and when your dad is a sailor, no topic of conversation is taboo. Like, you basically talk about everything. But money was the biggest one. So I remember things like growing up, and my dad would tell me things like how much he made, how much my mom made, what they paid for their house. And actually knowing things like how much stuff costs. Like, I remember going to the grocery store and them actually pointing out like how much things cost. So we knew, like, okay, for a family of 5, this is what groceries cost. I remember looking at their bank accounts, like all kinds of stuff. Like, we talked about money all the time. My dad was also someone who had this really, I will say, annoying when you're like 13, 14, 15 years old, habit of every morning he would read the newspaper, and when he would find an article about anything personal finance related, so whether it was about retirement savings accounts, real estate markets, the economy, just anything that was going on, my dad would cut them out and leave them on my bed for me to read, like when I got home from school. So I would like walk into the house, walk into my room and see these, and immediately roll my eyes and groan and be like, I have no interest in reading this right now. And unfortunately didn't. I will say that even though my dad talked to me about money all the time, I still made a lot of mistakes. And I think that's sort of just something that happens in life. We don't do everything just the way that our parents have hoped that we would. So I will say right now, so I'm 32 years old. When I was 25, I was maxed out with close to $30,000 of debt. And that was basically just consumer debt. So it wasn't even student loans. Like, I didn't even have a great excuse for why I was in that amount of debt. And if I were to switch that into pounds, I mean, you guys might know this stuff, I'd say it's probably like 17,000 pounds of like just consumer debt. And when I say maxed out, I was truly maxed out. I had $100 left in my bank account and $100 left on one of my credit cards. And I somehow had to make that last me for 6 weeks. So I had no choice at that point but to start taking my finances seriously and to start paying off my debt. And so I started this little blog that I wrote anonymously for a long time that I thought was just going to be this little place on the internet where I could document my debt repayment journey. No one was supposed to read it. Like, I never intended to ever have an audience or readership or anything like that. All I wanted to do, and it was as boring as this, is I would write these weekly spending reports. So weekly spending reports literally looked like just like Monday, I spent $2.91 at Starbucks. Tuesday, I spent $2.91 at Starbucks. Maybe I spent some money on groceries or something else. Wednesday, Thursday, except like that's all it was. I would post these every Sunday. There was nothing exciting about them. But then people started reading them and commenting, and I was like, what? What's going on here? And then I found this whole world of personal finance bloggers, a lot of people doing the same thing. So this was 2011, 2012, a couple of years after kind of financial crash. So I think everyone was sort of finally coming to this place of like, okay, it's time to really start getting serious with what we're doing with our money. What I will say is about being maxed out at that point is that it weighed so heavily on me that I became extremely aggressive about my debt repayment approach. So I can't say that I had like the best techniques for the way that I paid off my debt. I also look back at it and think that it was extremely, not just aggressive, like I was really hard on myself. So the things I used to say to myself when I was in debt was like, you're a bad person, you've screwed up all your chances of having a strong financial future. Kind of like I deserve to be punished and not have any sort of fun money or free money because I had just gotten myself into this horrible situation. And so I just deserved whatever it took to get out of it. And I paid off my debt in 2 years, and that sounds great on paper. But the problem then was that throughout those 2 years, I hadn't taken the time to learn why I had actually gotten into debt in the first place. So I didn't understand what my habits were. I didn't know actually what I had been overspending on all those years before. Like I kind of had this record of the past 2 years when I was paying off my debt, but I didn't really know anything about myself as a consumer because just for those 2 years, I was just like anti-consumption, anti-everything, which we can talk about that. Like I'm more in the mindful zone of that now. But I didn't know anything about myself. So on top of being super aggressive, being hard on myself and not learning anything, it's not that surprising to me that once I was debt-free, I actually just went back to spending basically all of my money. So there were months when I was paying off my debt where I would put up to 55% of my income towards debt repayment, and that was great. But again, a little bit too aggressive, like not quite something that could be sustainable, because again, I had no fun money. I didn't allow myself to do anything just for pure pleasure, like the simplest things that you enjoy. I didn't let myself do any of it. So there were months back then, 55% of my income going towards debt. And then the first year that I was debt-free, and I should have been set up, right, like to have this much more successful financial future. I should have been able to achieve all kinds of goals. And instead I was saving maybe 5% of my income. And I would write these blog posts then where I would say at the beginning of every month that I wanted to be saving 20% of my income. And then at the end of every month, I would be like, oh, hey guys, remember when I said that thing? I actually only saved like 3% or 5%. I think like the most was about 12 in an entire year. And it's not that I was saving nothing, but it's that writing that down every single month did not feel good. Like it didn't feel good to share it and have to tell people that I had not achieved my goal. But it also just didn't feel good for me because I knew that I could do better and that I really wanted to. So I will tell you about this challenge that I decided to sort of set out for myself, but everyone up front, like a question is always like, oh, why did you start doing it? Like, what was the goal? And I'm like, to be honest, like, I think we wish it was sort of like a more dramatic story, or we wish that there was some like huge, I don't know, rock bottom moment or something like that. But I think for me, something I've learned about myself is that I usually create change in my life after I've been thinking about it for a really long time and eventually get to a place where I'm just really uncomfortable and I have to make a change. So for me, all it was that once a month for 12 months in a row, I would think, like, I can do better than this. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but like I'm not happy with what I just did. I know I can do better. So what does that look like? And then after a year of being debt-free, not that surprisingly, had another money conversation with my family. My sister at the time was 20 years old and I was 29. And we're sitting at my parents' house, we're all just kind of hanging out, and my sister starts telling us about how she had just bought some camera or something for like $500. Now keep in mind, she's like a full-time university student, she is working part-time, but she doesn't have a ton of extra money, so we're all just kind of picking at her and being like, oh, like, you should save more of your money, like, don't spend it all. And she goes, yeah, but I save 20% of my income, so I can do whatever I want with the rest. And so first of all, I'm like, wait, what? Like, how has my sister figured this out before me? How is she saving 20% on her part-time salary? And I can't even do that, making a decent income at a financial startup. Okay, but then the words that came out of my mouth were just automatic. I didn't even think of them before I said them. I just said to her, yeah, but you live at home. Like, do you really need 80% of your income, or could you live on less? And then like, it was one of those things where I have no idea what anybody else said for like the next 5 minutes. And in my head, I'm like, whoa, like where did that question come from? Why have I never asked myself that? Like, do I need 90 or 95% of my income, or could I be living on less than that? And so the wheels just started turning from there. And within like a couple of weeks, I just sort of wrote down these rules for something that I called a shopping ban. When I think about the shopping ban now, I sort of wish I had called it something different because it sounds incredibly restrictive up front. It's like, no shopping, you can't buy anything. And that's not what the goal was, and that's not even what that year looked like. I just sort of had this idea that I didn't want to buy anything unless I absolutely needed it. And also knowing, like, I had never shopped like that before. I'd never spent money like that before, like waited until I actually needed something. I used to be someone who made a lot of preemptive purchases, right? Like you just buy things because you think, I'll need it one day, it will help me in that scenario. But I never waited until I just needed the thing, and then you buy the thing. So I just wrote these rules down, and I will say, so there were 3 different lists. The first list was the things I was allowed to buy. So basic stuff. You could call it even like consumables. So I was obviously allowed to buy groceries. I could put gas in my car, buy toiletries when you run out of them. Like I'm always like, if you run out of deodorant and toothpaste, everyone in your life wants you to buy more of that stuff. So please buy more of it. So anything that you are using often and run out of, buy it. Buy more of the stuff that you need. That's fine when you run out of it. The things I could not buy, that list was a lot longer. So I couldn't buy clothes, shoes, books, magazines, electronics, things for around the house. And then I added takeout coffee to that list of things I couldn't buy. And I will say I'm not a personal finance writer who's like, you're not allowed your $5 latte. Like I just had a $5 latte, well, a $5 Canadian latte. So I'm not one of those people who says that. I was just at the point with my finances where I was no longer comfortable with how much I was spending on it. And I was doing it strictly out of habit. Like it wasn't because I genuinely wanted the coffee even. It's just like this thing that I did all the time. And so I was just still doing it. So I was like, no more takeout coffee either. I also created this other short list because I decided to do this for an entire year. So I started trying to look ahead a little bit and just think of a few things that I might need in that upcoming year. So one was, I had 5 weddings to go to, and I'm not really someone who dresses up in general. So I was like, I need an outfit, so one outfit, a dress, shoes, or whatever, and that will be for all of the weddings. I knew that I had no kind of winter boots, and actually these are the ones I bought. So I bought these in 2014 and just still wear them now, which is great. And there was something else I really wanted. It was if I could save the money, I really wanted to buy a new bed that year because my bed was 13 years old. And I think because it was a bigger ticket item, I could never seem to save and actually afford to replace it. It's so interesting to look back at the psychology of that. Like in all my years previous, I was so quick to spend $20 here, $30 there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, how quickly that stuff adds up. And I could have just had $1,000 to buy a bed back then. But anyway, so I was like, if I can save the money, I would really like to buy a bed. That just was important to me. So I started this challenge on my 29th birthday, so it was July of 2014. Right up front, I also decided to start sort of a secondary challenge, which again, like I still think or wish I had a better reason for why I started it, but I just sort of got on that kick of decluttering. I definitely recognized the fact that I'd been spending a bunch of money on stuff that I probably didn't really need, wasn't even using. I could look around my home and see that I had more than enough stuff, and there was so much that I wasn't wearing anymore, I wasn't reading it, touching it, whatever, like I just wasn't using this stuff. So at the same time that I decided to stop shopping, I also decided I was going to declutter, which sounds really counterintuitive, but it ended up being like the very weird and great challenge to do together, because it all taught me about becoming a more mindful consumer in general. So I set out to do that. When I started decluttering, I will say like, that was the very first thing I sort of did. Like starting the shopping ban felt easy in the first few weeks. But when I started decluttering at the exact same time, what was so interesting about that was that I took inventory, which sounds so boring, but I took inventory of not only the amount of stuff that I got rid of, but also the things I was keeping. Now the reason that ended up being so important, like I was strictly doing it for a data point. Like I'm so nerdy that throughout this entire process, I was literally tracking like percentages of how much stuff I got rid of, how much stuff I kept. And it was just purely for me. Like it didn't matter for anyone else. I was just super curious how the numbers were gonna add up. And so the first couple of months, like I ended up decluttering 43% of my belongings in like just maybe a month and a half, 2 months. And it was really easy at first, but that list of inventory of the things that I kept, the reason it ended up being so important was because it helped me helped stop me from making a lot of impulse purchases. So throughout the shopping ban, there were numerous times where I did think about buying things, but then I was able to just sort of mentally check and go, you know what, when I started this, I actually still owned over 50 books that I haven't even read yet. I do not need to buy more books. And the same thing just for like toiletries, kind of the things you have the most of. So when people ask me now of like, well, what should I do if I was gonna start a shopping ban? I'm like, don't even start one, to be honest. Like, start by taking inventory of the stuff you own, because I think that alone will help people just stop making some of the impulse purchases that they're more inclined to make. So I decluttered, took inventory, and then I noticed kind of month 2, that is where the first time things really started to feel like they were a little bit trickier. And when I say this, okay, journalists keep asking me like what the hardest part was, and I'm like, to be honest, like the hardest part was really changing habits and the things you do all the time. So one of the hardest things for me was to give up takeout coffee, and then journalists laugh at that sometimes, like, oh, how silly, like you're just like, so, what a frivolous thing. And I'm like, no, you don't get it. Like, it's not about the takeout coffee. It's that is something I was doing habitually almost every single day, which meant that every single day I'm then in that moment where I'm like, oh, I want to do this thing. Oh, but I can't. And so you have to stop and start figuring out like what your triggers were and why you were thinking of doing that, and change your reaction. Like, I had never thought of changing my reaction before. I always just like, when I thought of getting takeout coffee, I just immediately got it. So it was the first time that I really had to start thinking about why I was even considering getting takeout coffee, and then changing my reaction to that. Gosh, what was like, so hardest parts, yeah, takeout coffee. Books were the next biggest one, and again, it's a habit. Like, I used to have this really bad habit, and it's so easy with stuff like Amazon. Like, you just hear of something online, and you can hear it from anywhere, and you immediately click over and you go to buy the thing. And then back then it was like you need $25 to get the free shipping. You just like add something else that sounds kind of okay, get your free shipping, bing, bang, boom. I do that like once a week or once every 2 weeks. I do not read that many books. Like, I really wish that I did, but I never did. It's very rare that I read that many books, but I did it all the time, which meant that at least once or twice a week I was kind of sitting there being like, well, that book sounds good. What do I do now? And so in the beginning, like, noticing that those were the 2 toughest ones for me, that would look different for everyone, because everyone's spending is so personal. And that's why, again, like, people ask me about shopping bans or doing something similar all the time, and I'm like, yours is gonna look different than mine. And what's hard for you is gonna look different than what looked hard for me, because everyone's are different. Like, the things that we have habits for, some of them are kind of similar, but often not. Like, everyone's values are so different. So those were the toughest parts. The changing the habit part is what then became the most important thing for me. Was like, with the takeout coffee, pretty easy, honestly. Well, you guys are lucky. Like, at work, it would just be here for you. But for me, it was like, okay, well, instead of going out to get takeout coffee, I just had to kind of leave all the stuff for like making coffee on the counter at all times. Like, if it's just there, then you do it. And then that becomes a habit, and like an enjoyable habit. I started enjoying making coffee every morning, and almost noticing it became this like really nice routine, because I was working remotely for the startup that I was at. And I would just enjoy my kind of slow mornings, getting up, making the coffee, kind of listening to a podcast or something, just relaxing a little bit, and then starting the day. It was so much easier than just, and actually, isn't that even weird to think about? Like, I was working remotely, and somehow it used to seem easier to get dressed and go downstairs to get coffee rather than just to make coffee. But it was just a habit. So changing that habit was easy, easy over time. The books one was tough. Like, I thought about buying books for a long, long time. I will say that I became very good friends with my library, and I actually had to get a new credit card that year because mine like had been compromised, and so they have to send you a new number and all of that. Still to this day, it's been almost 4 years, I do not have that credit card number memorized. I used to know all of them off by heart because it was just so easy to do online shopping. I still don't know what that one is, but I memorized my library card number within probably 3 weeks of having it because I used it all the time. And then another question I get, so aside from like my personal habits, is how did friends deal with it? That's probably the most common question I get at any kind of event that I do now. Like, what did friends do? What did family do? I feel super fortunate that my friends and family were mostly pretty supportive. Family, definitely. I think also because over the years, the thing that they had watched me do was sort of take on these big challenges and just do them. Like, other things I'd written about on the blog was not only paying off my debt in 2 years, but I also quit drinking in those 2 years, and I'm very open and honest about that in the book. So if you do read it, you will find a lot of stories about that. And I also decided to sort of take control of my health. I lost 30 pounds. I started training for my first half marathon. Like, I was just doing these big challenges. So family was just like, oh yeah, like, you'll do this thing, no problem. What was more interesting with friends is that at first, I will say our struggle was more just that friends didn't really seem to get the point. So I would find out all my friends had like gone out for dinner or something like that. I'm like, wait, where was my invite? And then they'd be all confused and be like, well, I thought I wasn't allowed, you weren't going to dinner. I'm like, no, I can go to dinner. Invite me to dinner. Like, I'm allowed to do that if I want to do that. So they're like, oh, okay. So friends seemed confused all the time. What was more interesting was when I would find myself listening to conversations with friends where they were talking about how much stuff they had bought, or like the deals they had got, or where they had bought something from. And I don't think I had ever realized how socially normal it is to talk about shopping. Like, I was really naive when I started. I just kind of thought no one would care and it wouldn't be a big deal. And this is something I also noticed, obviously, when I quit drinking. Like, drinking is very culturally normal, and so you're in a lot of conversations where now you're like, okay, I'm not part of this conversation anymore. Like, I can't add anything to it. I can't participate in any way. And with shopping, I just didn't think that was going to be a thing. But it came up all the time. And it can be as simple as like, where did you get your shoes? Where did you get your bag? Oh, what book are you reading right now? Where did you get it from? Who'd you hear about? Like, just anything. People talk about the stuff that they buy all the time. And so it's not that friends cared. It was really that it was one of those moments, and I think about this a lot, like especially when you're sober, you often find yourself in situations where you feel like the only sober person in the room, because you genuinely are. Like, you're the only one who isn't participating. And with these conversations, it ended up being the same. So I will say, I mean, the first 6 months or so of the shopping ban were just tough in terms of like figuring out what my habits were, how to change them, and then also starting to question a little bit more what my values actually were and the things I actually did want to be spending money on. But it got a little bit tougher about halfway through. So in the book I talk about it a lot, but my parents ended up announcing that they were getting divorced that year. And I think it was the first time that I really recognized that I was more, I'll just say, like an emotional consumer. So I think what I realized that year was that in the past, what I would have done was probably drank my way through that. I'm also pretty honest about, like, when I was younger, like binge eating, things like that. And because I didn't have those, and now I also didn't have spending as an option, I had to do the tougher part, which is you just have to feel the hard feelings. And that's not great advice, sort of. Like, people are always like, okay, if you couldn't do that, like, what did you do? And I'm like, I cried a lot that year. Like, it was really not that exciting. It wasn't a great year all around, or for all parts of it, but it was a really hard year, and I had to learn how to feel feelings for the first time and just like get through it. So what ended up getting easier after that was finally coming to a place where I had a goal. Like, I didn't have a goal really when I got started. I sort of wrote these few things down. I'm like, I want to spend less and I want to save more, and it was definitely just this kind of financial journey that I was on. But then I just thought and the other part of that was that I said I wanted to also become a more mindful consumer, which I truly was just kind of making up. Like, I didn't even know what that really meant. I'm like, that sounds like a good thing. Like, if I could be a more mindful consumer, that sounds great. But I didn't really have a financial goal. So halfway through, like, I was doing pretty good. I was saving typically about like 20% of my income every month. I was spending a bit on travel for the first time, which felt great because travel was something I'd always wanted to do, but I'd never seemed to have the money to do it because I was sort of just mindlessly spending money on whatever else. So I was spending a bit on travel, living on much less than I had been before. But then I decided, or sort of in looking at my finances, realized that not only was I living on less, but I was also doing a bit more freelance, to the point that I realized I was actually earning the amount of money that I was living on at that time. So it started to become an option to me that I could maybe quit and either work for myself or just figure something out. And that is a position I had never been in and never even imagined being in before. Like, I'd never thought to myself that I would work for myself. Like, I grew up with parents who worked in the public service, and so I just, entrepreneurship or whatever, like, it just wasn't something I ever aspired to or thought would be part of my future. But once I realized that my spending was exactly how much I was already earning just on the side, I'm like, okay, like, there's a little bit more motivation here to keep going. And I sort of kicked it into high gear at that point. In the last 6 months, you know, I made this decision to quit my job, and I ended up on those months, I don't know, like, there were months in there I probably saved up to 45% of my income. And by the end of it, had enough money that I felt completely comfortable quitting and knew that even if I could only do it for like 6 or 8 months, I had tons of money, like I had lined up a ton of work and I had tons of money in the bank, and that I could at least make it work for probably 6 months to a year, and that it just would have been worth trying. And I was someone who never took chances on myself before. Like when I really look back at the kind of consumer that I was, I used to buy things for all the wrong reasons, and even when, as a drinker too, like I wrapped so much of my self-worth up in the wrong things and in trying to be someone that I actually wasn't. And in that year, I ended up decluttering 70% of my belongings. As part of that, I remember the toughest part right towards the end of decluttering was realizing that everything left over was stuff I actually used, but there were these few items that I had held on to that were sort of for this more like aspirational version of myself. So I used to buy books that I would think like, I don't know, like a smarter or just more interesting version of myself might read. Or I would buy clothes that like a more professional or put together version of myself might wear. Creative projects were a big one. I had so many different, like everything from a DSLR camera to scrapbooking stuff to painting stuff. Like I had all these different materials for creative projects that I thought I might do one day, but I never did any of them because the real me wasn't actually interested in any of it. And so I remember in letting go of all of that and sort of letting go that through that entire year of just all the stuff that I didn't need, I realized the things that I actually do value and who I really am as a person. And it became a lot easier to start making spending decisions once I actually knew who I was already. So I don't want to like cut it short there, but I'm like, there's more I could say, but I don't know. I've seen like a few faces where I'm like, are there any questions yet? Oh no. Okay. Well, what I will say is that when I finished the year, I had quit my job. I had lived on an average of 51% of my income. I saved 31% of it, and I spent 18% on travel, which was a lot of money, but I'd never been able to do that before. And so even if we had cut that out, though, like if I hadn't spent anything on travel, I would have saved 49% of my income. And a lot of that truly just came back to making more mindful decisions every day, every week. Not that I was buying nothing. I also want to say I don't believe that buying stuff is bad or spending money is bad. I buy things now and I spend money. I'm on a 6-week vacation right now, and I've bought books since I've been here and a few other things. Like I don't think it's about that. It really, for me, was about getting to a place where I could figure out like who I was, and it makes spending decisions so much easier because now I know when I make a purchase, it's for something I actually need or I really want it in that moment. Like it feels really amazing to buy a book because you genuinely really want to read it, and like that day you sit down and read it in 3 or 4 hours. That feels really good, and that is something I can't say about past me. I never knew how to do that, but yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you. So the only part you haven't mentioned yet is when you decided to write the book and how you went from kind of this experiment to becoming an author.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, okay, so the question just being about when I decided to write the book. I don't know that that was a decision. It was this really amazing twist of events that happened after I finished the year. So earlier that year I had done an interview with someone at Forbes, and the interview was about someone else. She was like, I know, because I knew kind of everyone in the personal finance space, and she's like, I know that you have a good relationship with this person. I'm doing a profile on them, and I would really love a couple quotes of just like what they mean to the community. So we did this great interview, she got the quotes, and at the end of it she goes, now when you're done doing like the thing you're doing, like let me know, we can write a profile about it. So I reached out to her about a month before because I knew like the last couple months especially, I was like, I've got this in the bag. Like this shopping ban thing is just like a way of life. Like I'm saving as much money as I can so I can quit my job. This is easy. So I emailed her to say like, hey, I'm almost done, or I'll be done soon. Let's do the interview. And the day it came out, which was actually the last day of the shopping ban, it came out. She emailed me the link that morning and goes, just FYI, these things have a tendency to go viral. And I'm like, what? And within 2 weeks, I had been contacted by 6 different literary agents. So I never made that decision. Like, it was sort of something that came after. And it's been really interesting because I think as a writer, like as a creative, you sort of struggle with like, I didn't set out to do it, but at the same time, I was writing about something that people are obviously thinking about. And so I mean, publishers, literary agents just like saw that, and it just became an option. It's sort of one of those things too, like it was like quitting my job was never the goal either, right? And it just became an option. It was the first time where I was really in a position where I could take an opportunity and kind of move forward with it. So it just became an option.
It's also so ironic that you gave up writing. You gave up buying books.
It is. Although I will say about that too is like, I don't tell anyone to just like go out and buy the book. I'm always like, talk about this now, like I buy books when I know I'm going to read it. So if it feels like something you want to read now, then buy it, or ask your library if they have it. I don't know how the library system works over here, but like in North America, you can just go and ask your library to get the book. And that also helps authors. Like authors, not maybe in over here, but in North America, authors actually, like a small amount, like get paid out every single time your book is checked out. So just an FYI, like it's just as, not maybe just as good, but it all helps. It all helps. And so I just always think about that. Like I would never go out and tell anyone to buy any book, but yeah, no, the irony is real, and it is not lost on me.
Can I ask a question? What would you say are some of the treats that you've kind of, so you mentioned travel, but just aside from that, what would you say that you're doing now that you haven't done before that is maybe a splurge or an expense that you wouldn't have considered, like a treat?
Well, it's funny, like the word treat, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, the word like treat or treat yourself, things like YOLO, like all the sort of different phrases that are out there. The reason I don't like them just sort of in general, like not even just that we say them to each other, although part of that I don't like is that like I think everyone truly wants to be saving more money, and yet we've created these little phrases where we're all encouraging each other to spend more. It's really weird. So I don't like that word because for me it makes it still feel like it's something I shouldn't be having, sort of. So for me, I actually believe, like I don't really have thoughts on like needs versus wants. Like if you really want something, it's just a need. If it fits in your budget, it's a need. So I would say now as a consumer, I mean, I pretty much never buy clothes. There's all these things that like I just realized I don't care about, but I buy books. I don't buy more than I read, but it feels really amazing now to, I would say I buy more books in bookstores. Like I don't buy anything online really anymore, and that for me has come from this place of it's so much different to walk into a bookstore, really read a few pages of it, like get an actual feel for what the book is like, and then making the decision to buy it, rather than just like hearing about it immediately, getting it online. So I probably spend more on books because I do it that way. But I also, it's like something that's super weird, or like people keep calling me a minimalist. I'm like, I don't even know if I would call myself one, because I do like tangible stuff. Like I like real books. I don't really like ebooks. So probably just books still, just differently. It's just a lot different buying them now than it used to be.
One of the things people say it's now with credit cards and online, you mentioned that you don't actually track the money you're spending. It's very easy because you don't actually physically experience them. Did you use any tricks like playing more with cash or something like this, or any kind of similar things? You mentioned going to the actual bookstores via online. Anything else that helps?
It's funny that too, I love that question because my answer still is not great in the sense of I think it's going to be personal for everyone. So I remember trying a cash budget years ago, actually, when I was trying to pay off my debt, and it just did not work for me, or at least like the way I was doing it. I think because I had tried to really restrict myself, like this is the amount of money I'm allowed for 2 weeks, but then like things genuinely do come up in that time. You're like, even if it's only $20, you're like, I actually really need that money. Like, what am I supposed to do now? So cash doesn't quite work for me. I would say now, like I basically pay for everything with credit, but that's been a cycle. Like when I was paying off my debt, I never used my credit. For about a year after that, I didn't really love using it. And then now I'm just at a place that I'm really comfortable with my spending because I know I won't overspend. Like I trust myself and look at my spending weekly, and so I just know that I'm doing okay. But I think it really, it's really personal for everyone. The one thing that I have done for a long time and still do to this day is I actually put pen to paper and write things down. So in a journal, I will literally write down how much I spend every day and on what. And I don't do that quite as much anymore, but I did it for years because for me, there's something so different. It was the same way as like publishing it on the blog, like knowing that I had to write down the exact amounts and put it out there, I naturally just started to spend less, because you'd see like, oh, you know what, it actually doesn't feel great to be spending money on Starbucks like every single day. So maybe I'm gonna cut it down just a little bit. So I don't know, like I'm super old school. I love technology for so many things, but there's something about spending, like writing it down by hand, it just helped me become more mindful of it over the years.
More questions?
Hi. So I guess it's been quite a bit of trial and error through the process. My question's more about like, is there anything over this amount of time, or like is there one thing that you would have done differently? Or like anything that you particularly regret around decisions that you made?
Good question. I don't know about do it differently. I guess I actually forgot about one story in this, is that it was, I guess, four and a bit months into the first year of the shopping ban, because I actually didn't even say this, but when the first year was over, I ended up doing it for a second year. And again, just for sort of data points, which is super boring, but I was super curious about things like, how much stuff do I actually use? Like how many things of toothpaste do I actually use in a year, or deodorant or lotion or cosmetics, like things like that. So I will say it was a regret in the first year. I sort of wished I had kept track of all of that, and not because it's like earth-shattering information. Like it doesn't even matter to anyone else except for me. But having that information now, like tracking that for a year, it really helped me figure out, as sort of like an semi-average female consumer, like how much stuff am I actually using, which then it just keeps preventing me from making impulse purchases, right? Like I'm like, I know that I don't need to go stock up on stuff because it takes a long time to actually use things up. So that was sort of a regret. But one thing that did happen was 4.5 months into it, Black Friday came up. And one of the things that I had done when I started the shopping ban was I unsubscribed from basically everything, and I also unfollowed like all retailers on social media. So I thought I was doing great. Like I wasn't really getting those emails anymore. I wasn't being told about all the different things I could buy. So I thought I was doing good. And then somehow on Black Friday, I got an email from my favorite bookstore. And I actually talked myself in to buying something. So I talked myself into, and like it was really this exercise after that, like, because it happened so quickly, and like people call them impulse purchases, and in that moment I was like, I've actually done this a lot before, and it feels a lot more like a blackout purchase, where like it's so quick, and then all of a sudden you have a confirmation email that's like, here's this thing you did. You're like, wait, I did what? Like, how much did I just spend? So on Black Friday that happened. So all of a sudden I see that I have an e-reader, like a confirmation I have bought a new e-reader. I immediately cancel the order and then go, what just happened? And I realized there are so many stories we tell ourselves to justify something. And it's not that the e-reader would have been bad per se. Mine was broken. So these are like the stories I was telling myself. Mine was broken. It did work, but you had to, you know, like the reset pin or like little hole you have to stick a pin in? I had to do that every time I wanted to turn it on. So I sort of had to have a pin available at all times. So it sort of would have helped me, but I didn't need it. Like I didn't actually need it. So I'm telling myself all this stuff, and like, you haven't bought yourself anything in so long, and you've never seen it this low before in price, and all this stuff. It happens so quickly, and then you just make the purchase. And so I think it wasn't a regret, because actually something I realized that year was that past me, anytime I would have sort of like screwed up a challenge or like gone off track, old me would have been really hard on myself and sort of just shamed myself and made myself feel really, really bad for it. And that was the first time I was like, I have to take this as a learning experience instead, figure out what just happened, so that going forward, I can just start changing my behavior or becoming more cognizant, like in that specific example of like, what are the stories I tell myself before thinking about making a purchase?
Hi, this is probably quite a difficult question, but I wondered, having gone through everything you've gone through and thinking about everything in the way that you have, what are your thoughts on how far your behaviour in the past was kind of innate human behaviour, or how much was it based on the context we all find ourselves in now, where there's so much stuff available?
No, it's a really good question. So it's sort of two parts, or just like, part of it is I don't know, because I don't know what my old spending was. Like when I got into debt especially, I never tracked spending in my life, right? I just kept seeing that my balance was growing, and I truly It was so bad. I stopped looking at my credit cards. I just saw that the balance was growing, and as long as I could make the minimum payment, I felt like I was going to be okay. And so I don't know, honestly, what old me really spent money on. I'm guessing there was probably not only social, like influence from things like social media, but just generally social influence. Like when your friends are doing something, you just do it too. I also know parts of my debt came from partying too much, or just in the sense of like I never wanted to say no. So anytime friends asked me to hang out, I would just say yes, even if it meant I was putting it on credit. So I don't know, like I'm sure there's a mix of kind of both there. But I do know at the end of the day, when I look at some of the things that I was buying and some of the stuff I was spending money on, and especially with partying, like so much of my self-worth was wrapped up in the fact that I was a really good partier and people loved partying with me. And I truly, like, as soon as I quit drinking, I almost had like an identity crisis of just like, I don't even know what I'm good at or why people would want to be friends with me or want to hang out with me. Because that was my life. My life was so revolved around partying that I just didn't get it. So not only in trying to figure that out and then decluttering and looking at some of my stuff, I'm like, there's so much stuff I used to do for the wrong reason. Like I just didn't understand who I was as a person. And in starting to just like kind of let stuff go, that was the first time I really started to figure it out. And I'm like, the answers were so simple. I'm like, I'm a writer, I'm a reader, so like I like books. Like I'm a writer, I'm a reader, I hike a lot, I'm a sister, like I'm a friend, I'm a daughter. Like who I am, they're actually all pretty simple things. And so once I sort of figured that stuff out, it just made spending easier now. But old me, I don't know, I'd say a big mix.
Oh, sorry.
Like how regiment did you go like when you first started? Like were you like watching how much water you were using in the shower and that sort of stuff?
Oh.
Or is it just spending?
Just spending.
Just spending.
Yeah, no, just spending. Yeah, no, it's a good question though, because that's sort of a topic in general that's pretty hot right now too, of like extreme frugality and the things that people will do to sort of cut back. That for me has never quite aligned with like who I am or what I'm about. Because like I said, I still went to restaurants and I bought something if I needed it. Like there were a few things that year, and I think women can probably relate to this. Like I only owned one pair of jeans and they ripped in the inner thigh. And like that only lasts for so long. Like you can only fix that so many times before you have to replace that. So no, it wasn't about like spending no money. It was really for the first time like having to ask myself like why I'm thinking of buying something. I almost think too, like make a visual of it. Like it was kind of putting a barrier between me and every single purchase where you almost are like hitting a pause button and like asking yourself a few questions before you're doing it. So instead of just automatically making the purchase, getting the thing, it was kind of like hitting pause and just going, like, do I really need this thing? What's going on in my head right now? How am I feeling? What's going on in my life? What influencers are around me right now? Like what's going on? But yeah.
Cool. I think that's any more questions? Well, thank you very much for that, Cait.
Thank
Can we
you.
give Cait a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.